and it means someone who is multi-talented, gifted beyond belief, whose curiosity runs beyond the horizon. And the importance of that word is he represents that. Timothy is truly a polymath and a wonderful, wonderful asset to our community. What we're going to do in this session and then the next 2 weeks that follow, and by the way, you're not going to get a reminder in your box for next week or the following week because it's a dementia test. Timothy brings us a very interesting insight and came through a conversation that he and I have had over time about looking at history in different ways. And the 3 occasions we have will be him teaching us how to look at art as a display of a particular time in history and a progression of history through art. So, it's an ear, eye, brain, heart event, and I am thrilled to have you.
Thank you. The only thing I'm going to promise you today is that I will not sing. That was a little more enthusiasm than we needed, Jim. But
It could be worse, I could say.
but seriously, I am by trade a historian. I taught history for 33 years to college students. And my father, when I was about, 10 or 11 years old, named me the museum rat because I started getting interested in art when I was about 8 or 9 years old, due to my beloved late Aunt Therese, who loved art. And she used to take me to the museum, and from then on, it was all over. I studied art for a number of years through high school till I asked my father if I could go to art school, and he said, wait a minute. He said, isn't that the profession where you get to sit in a dark attic with a naked light bulb hanging down? If you can pay for it, you can do it. So I became a historian instead. Anyway, the period that we're going to look at is the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe, which is also known as the Renaissance or the High Renaissance. It is also known to historians as the early modern period. It is one of the most revolutionary periods in world history, to say nothing of European history. And by revolutionary, I don't mean wars, uprisings, revolts. I mean revolution in culture. Everything was changing in this period at a very, very rapid pace. This was the period when the economic system we call capitalism started to emerge as the dominant economic activity in Europe. Prior to that, in the Middle Ages, it was all agriculture. Now, it's trading, long-distance trading, it's manufacturing, it's banking. Banking used to be a sin. Well, I guarantee you, by the 16th century in Venice and Brussels and Antwerp and London, it was no longer a sin. Education, this was the period when, this was after Gutenberg had invented movable type, and there was an explosion in people of all levels being able to read and in some cases write. Universities were popping up all over the place, teaching theology and science and the arts. It was an incredible time to be alive. Of course, to enjoy the whole thing, you had to be alive for 200 years, but still, in any period. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And we are going to be talking about how the art of this period reflected what was going on in history, and in particular, the focus is going to be on the Protestant Reformation, which officially began, it actually began long before then, but it officially began when? You all know the date, right?
1517.
1517, in the little town of Wittenberg in Saxony, which is in east central, what is today Germany. Back then, Saxony was a semi-independent province of the Holy Roman Empire. You remember the Holy Roman Empire, the one that Voltaire in the 18th century was neither Holy Roman or an empire anymore? Okay. So that's what we're going to be looking at. But let's get to the art. This is the first painting, and I will take a little time to, let me get my little pointer, because there's a couple of things I want to point out specifically. Yeah, there we go. Okay, the name of this painting, and listen to the title. The title's important. The name of the painting is Harbor Scene. Duh. Harbor Scene with St. Paul embarking from Caesarea. Now, this painting was painted in the late 16th century, 1596, by a guy named Jan Bruegel the Elder. And Jan Bruegel was what we call a Netherlandish. Art historians refer to them as Netherlandish rather than saying Dutch or Belgian, because there's so much confusion, not only to what the Netherlands were at that time, but he's a Netherlandish painter. So the first part of the title is obvious. And as I say, it's 16th century. Okay, well, I can point with my finger. This is a fairly typical ocean-going ship of the 16th century. They called them galleons. And they were used by England and Holland and Spain and Portugal. All the ocean-going countries at that time used galleons. And they could sail across the Atlantic. But the second part of the title, St. Paul embarking from Caesarea. Now that took place in the year 57 AD, first century, okay? You remember. Paul boarded a ship headed for Rome, where he was to appear before the imperial court for being, in the Roman eyes, an insurrectionist. That is, a troublemaker. And he had all kinds of interesting adventures on the way, including getting shipwrecked. Okay, but he made it to Rome. So St. Paul is embarking. Now, and Bob, you can't answer this one because I saw you looking carefully at the picture before. Can anyone find St. Paul in this picture? Well, even if you do, you're taking a long time. Okay, let me point out St. Paul, who gets, maybe second billing, but still, he's billed in the title. Oops, sorry. You got to be careful with this thing because it's magic. There we go. Okay. Here is St. Paul in the far right corner of the picture. And you wouldn't be able to pick him out even if you had studied this picture dozens of times, which I had the privilege of doing when I worked at the museum in Raleigh, except that he's got the halo. Okay? He is also dressed, as are several of the other people in the picture, including some of these gentlemen over here on a wharf. He is dressed in what at least people imagined was first century dress. Whereas these people, some of these people are probably officials. Someone guessed that some of them are probably clergymen, ministers, fishermen, merchants coming to buy fish. Maybe they own restaurants, who knows. More officials. You can tell the officials, by the way, in addition to their ruffs, they carry those, and they were mostly ceremonial looking, these pikes. So these guys have got helmets on, so they're cops. We don't know what's going on there, but there's some kind of a hassle going on. Okay? And there's St. Paul. So why is St. Paul in the title, even though he clearly has second billing? Well, you need to know that almost all painters at that time painted on commission. Somebody came to them and said, Jan, I would like a picture for my study or my living room or whatever, and I would like it to feature St. Paul embarking from Caesarea to Rome. And from that point on, it was up to Jan to figure out how to do that. But he knew his audience, and he knew what was important to them. So that's why he decided to interpret the scene by putting it in a busy 16th century Netherlandish port, because that was life. And those aspects of life in the minds of many people who lived in that area were just as holy, just as sacred as St. Paul leaving the Holy Land to go to Rome. That's sort of my interpretation from my study of the culture of that time, but there's another clue which put it over the top for me. Okay? Okay, this is a typical scene. This is the kind of scene that, you know, if you could have gone to New York in the 16th century, you would have seen something like this. A busy port with business people and officials and fishermen and so on. But look up here in the top left-hand corner, way up there. See if he's working now. There he is. Well, at first you think, when you're looking at the picture, it's a hawk, specifically an osprey, because ospreys like fish. But then you look at it again, and you remember the title, and you remember how the culture of the time, what ordinary people did, was considered holy, sacred. Maybe it's an angel. Maybe it's an angel hanging in the sky in front of the sun, blessing this entire scene. So all of a sudden, if you buy that particular interpretation, which I do, if you buy that interpretation, this is a lot of what the 16th and 17th century were all about, and it is also a lot about what brought on the Reformation. Okay? There was a culture in Northern Europe, which Southern Europe had to a degree, but not to the degree in Germany and the Netherlands and England. It was a culture of ordinary people stepping up, becoming important. And when I say ordinary people, I am talking about anybody who was outside of the old medieval way of structuring society, which was the aristocracy, with the kings, of course, at the top of the aristocrats, and the emperors, let's not forget those guys, and the clergy. Remember, the leaders of the clergy, in England, for example, today, bishops of the Church of England are still known as Lords Spiritual. And they get to wear those fancy red robes with the white ermine collars in the House of Lords. And how'd they get that job? By being a bishop. Just the way the other lords did, by being an aristocrat. But this is an age where these ordinary people, commoners, are starting to emerge as important people to be reckoned with. And of course, at the top, naturally, are people who are the most prosperous. So you find the bankers and the merchants and the shippers. Clergy still had that special respect, but in the Netherlands, particularly after the Reformation took hold in the Netherlands, especially in the northern Netherlands, they were no longer considered lords. Do you know there are parts of the Netherlands in the 16th century that were ruled over by bishops? Yeah. Large part of Austria, what is today Austria, its ruler was a bishop. They were lords, okay? Even though many of them started out as commoners, but once you made that step into the rank of the clergy, it was different. So this is sort of, I don't know, I could stop right here and say this is what the Reformation in some way, the effect of the Reformation in some way, or what led up to the Reformation in some way in Northern Europe was all about. But nah. Well, when we think about the Reformation, I think the first thing that comes to most of our minds are the religious leaders. Martin Luther, John Calvin, Huldrych Zwingli. I just like saying that name. Okay? William Farel, and so forth. But the Reformation was as much a political event as it was a religious event. That is to say, without the politicians, the Reformation probably never would have developed the way it did. It might not have developed at all. So let's look at some of those people and paintings of these people. The name of this painting is The Wittenberg Reformers, and it is by a guy named Lucas Cranach. And Lucas Cranach painted Martin Luther, who he was a close friend of and a supporter of, it is said, over 70 times. And I know of at least 2 portraits, because I've seen them. One hangs in the Toledo Museum of Art, my hometown. The other hangs in the North Carolina Museum of Art, of Martin Luther. And this guy, this thing works when it wants to. Okay, here are 2 of the people that we refer to, especially if you're Lutheran, as Lutheran reformers. Over here on the far left is Martin Luther himself. And this guy is Philip Melanchthon. And Philip Melanchthon was an important theologian. All around, talk about a polymath. I mean, he was a real polymath. Spoke about every ancient and modern language that existed at the time. But he's not the center of the picture. Luther's not the center of the picture. This guy is the center of the picture, front and center. Frederick the Wise. Frederick the Wise was the Elector of Saxony. the ruler of this semi-independent state that was part of the Holy Roman Empire. And one of the things that Frederick the Wise and several of the other rulers of these northern provinces were dealing with at the time was breaking the control of the Holy Roman Emperor, who worked hand in hand with the Bishop of Rome, sometimes known as the Pope. Okay? When Luther posted his 95 Theses in 1517, and then later was called before the Diet of Worms to explain himself to all of these Catholic bishops drawn in from all of the Holy Roman Empire and representatives of the emperor himself and the Pope himself. Remember 1521, that's when Luther said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Karen knows how to say that in German, but I'm not going to try that. Okay? Luther became an outlaw. Luther did one of the things that you could do to fall out of favor at the peril of your life in the Holy Roman Empire. And Frederick the Wise, by this time, was a Luther fan and probably had converted to what we later call Lutheranism, spirited him away after the Diet, because they had to decide, well, you know, are we going to burn this guy at stake, or are we just going to throw him in a dungeon for the rest of his life, and hid him away in a castle somewhere out in the back country of Saxony. It was there that Luther translated the Bible into German. He had a year to do it. That's how long he was in hiding. By the time a year was up, it was safe, because the powers of the Holy Roman Empire no longer extended into provinces like Saxony, thanks to Frederick the Wise. Okay? Here's another guy. He's probably not as famous. This is the English Reformation, and this is Thomas Cromwell. Thomas Cromwell, talk about coming up from the ranks, an ordinary guy. He was the son of a tradesman. He ran away from home when he was a teenager. He ended up in Europe as a soldier. He was a freebooter, that is, he traveled around in whatever army could use him. He was apparently pretty good at it. While he was in Europe, he learned many languages. He was gifted in languages. He started picking up law, and he became a diplomat. That is, he would speak to the opposing sides and see if, he could get some sort of a peaceful resolution. He came back to England, and he got a job with Thomas Wolsey. His title was Cardinal Wolsey. And Thomas Wolsey was not only the highest ranking churchman in England, because he was a cardinal. He wasn't the Archbishop of Canterbury, but he was a cardinal. He was also the highest ranking advisor to the King of England, our friend Henry VIII. Okay? Henry VIII had a problem back in those days. That is, he wanted an heir. He was only the second member of his dynasty, and he wanted that dynasty, the Tudor dynasty, to continue. And he blamed, naturally, as men did back then, I suppose some still do now, he blamed his wife. She was barren. So he had to annul the wedding, annul the marriage. That's not a divorce. An annulment means it never happened. But only the Pope of Rome could annul his marriage, because the Catholic Church was the state church of England at the time. Wolsey was given the task. Wolsey failed at the task. Wolsey fell from power. Cromwell was Wolsey's secretary and lawyer. And Cromwell went to work for Henry VIII. And he said, I can take care of your problem for you. The trick is not to annul the marriage, it's to divorce your wife. But you can only do that if you break with Rome and declare yourself the supreme head of the church, of the Christian church in England. Henry thought that sounded like a pretty good idea. He was sort of a Renaissance monarch anyway. He wanted ultimate power. So he did just that, and Cromwell started moving up in the ranks. And if anybody made Protestantism, the kind of Protestantism that John Calvin and Martin Luther represented, the state religion or an important religion in England, it was this guy. Just a couple of things he did. One of the things he did is he said to Henry, he said, you know, those monasteries and those bishops, those Catholic bishops and those Catholic Benedictine and Carthusian abbeys, do you know how much land they own? 1/3 of the productive land of England was in the hands of the church. And he says, you know, now that you're head of the church, just throw those guys out. Confiscate their land. Sell the land off to your friends and your supporters, and you will become immensely more wealthy than you already are. And Henry thought that was a pretty good idea, too. Okay? Theologically, and in terms of practice, for example, what happens in church at a service on Sunday, Henry was not that crazy about the Protestants, many of whom were already active in England. In fact, one of the people Cromwell met when he was in Europe, traveling around doing various things, was William Tyndale, who was one of the first people to translate the Bible into English, which was against the law. People were burned at the stake for doing that. Even having a copy of the Tyndale Bible was against the law. And it was people like Tyndale and also Calvin and Luther and others who converted Cromwell to his Protestant beliefs. So he encouraged Protestants in England who started emerging. But Henry kind of liked the old routine of the Catholic Church, and particularly the ceremonies of the Catholic Church, the liturgy, other practices. So Protestantism kind of broke into two branches in England. There was the High Church, the Church of England. The king was the head of that. And there were several other groups that started coming along, and they made up the Low Church. That is to say, they were tolerated. You could be a Calvinist, you could be a Lutheran in England. You weren't going to get into the House of Lords by doing that. And you certainly weren't going to change the Mass as the number one ceremony of the church. But we'll tolerate you, and you can do what they're doing now by this time in England, or excuse me, in Holland, Scotland, Germany. Okay? So Henry throughout his life was not enthusiastic about what we normally think of theologically and in practice as Protestantism. But to the degree that Henry was successful and that he became more and more powerful, Cromwell was the guy who did it. Cromwell was a true Protestant in that sense. He was also nobody to mess with. Oh, there he is. Henry VIII of that name, in all of his splendor and glory. This picture was painted by Hans Holbein the Younger. Holbein was a German/Swiss painter who migrated to England because that's where the business was. He was a portrait painter, and he was one of the great portrait painters of all history, but certainly of the Renaissance. That is probably, it's a flattering, but it is probably a very accurate picture of what Henry VIII looked like in 1537. And by 1537, of course, he was also supreme head of the church in England. Check out the outfit. That's gold lace on the sleeves. And even their undergarments, the fabric was so fancy, so good, that they actually cut little slits in their shirts on the sleeves, and they pulled pieces of it out so you could see that it was the finest linen or the finest silk or what have you.
Perfectly.
Yeah, yeah. This is a Renaissance absolute monarch, and he was an absolute monarch. If you crossed Henry VIII, as Thomas Cromwell finally did, by the way, off went your head. And Boleyn found that out. Okay? So Henry VIII was certainly one of the most important political leaders of the Protestant Reformation. So without the politicians, without the Frederick the Wises and the Henry VIIIs, it's hard to say how much progress the Reformation would have made. Would it have been just a bunch of guys like Wycliffe and Tyndale in England and Jan Hus in Czechoslovakia, who were troublesome and they had followers, but we could control them. But once you get the rulers on your side. Well, let's look at some pictures of ordinary people. And it didn't get any more ordinary than this. This is a painting called Peasant Wedding, and it is by Jan Bruegel's father, Peter Bruegel, the elder. And Peter Bruegel, this was painted also in the late 16th century, and Peter Bruegel loved painting scenes of ordinary people. This is a peasant wedding, and what's interesting about this historically is that until fairly recently in history, farmers, most farmers, the vast majority of farmers, were serfs. And by a serf, I mean they were bound to the land. They could not leave the land. They could not expand their land. And a large portion of what they produced went to the person who owned the land, and the person who owned the land was usually an aristocrat. Then, in the 14th century, the plague came along, and the plague, as you probably have heard, wiped out a large portion of the population of Europe. And labor became short. It was also a period when cities like Antwerp and Hamburg and cities going all the way over into Lithuania started declaring their independence. And they built walls so the aristocrats couldn't come in and take over. And that's where the centers of trading and banking and manufacturing. So a lot of people went to the cities to escape serfdom. And so the aristocrats who owned the land had to start granting more and more and more people, thousands and then hundreds of thousands, their freedom. And some of these people were ambitious and hardworking, and they started buying up land, they saving money, and then buying up land, and they became prosperous farmers, freeholders, no longer serfs. This is a wedding reception of a family that fell into that category. Where is she? Okay. This is probably the most important person in a wedding like this. Who do you think that is? Pardon?
The bride's mother.
Okay, the bride's mother. That is the mother of the bride. which I'm not sure exactly she's wearing a crown, you notice, and I'm not sure exactly what the little symbol is above, but I have a feeling it means that she's the important one here. This is probably the father of the bride. This is probably a local businessman. Here's another interesting thing. Notice this guy. He's a commoner. He's not an aristocrat. This guy is certainly a commoner. He's one of the musicians. See, they're playing pipes. They are both carrying weapons. Before this period in history, before the early modern period in history, to carry a weapon was illegal, and it was a capital offense. Not anymore. Now you can openly carry a dagger. Swords were a little clumsy, so, daggers were usually what you had. And that, too, shows how things have changed for common people. By the way, my favorite person in this painting, I love that little guy. He's wearing Dad's hat. He swiped a pie from the tray as it went past and is enjoying it. But here's a group of people that 200 years before, or even 100 years before, they just wouldn't have been able to have a celebration like this. There's lots of food, and lots of drink, and lots of music, and lots of socializing. And my guess is, there's not a serf in the hall. Okay? This is one of my favorite paintings. This one hangs in the museum in my hometown. It is called the Syndics, which means basically the leaders. The Syndics of the Goldsmiths Guild in Amsterdam. And it is painted by a guy named Thomas de Keyser. And Thomas de Keyser was an incredibly important artist in Amsterdam. It wasn't until Rembrandt came along that he got knocked off of, the number one position. But this is a great painting for a lot of reasons. By this time, the northern part of the Netherlands, Holland, has become largely Calvinist. But at the same time, there's a great deal of toleration going on. It is not an offense. It is not a criminal offense to be a Catholic. And it's probably not even going to hurt your career. Are these guys Calvinists? Yeah, they kind of look like Calvinists. They're dressed in black. And the Calvinists didn't like people who dressed in fancy colors like red, because that was a color that was associated with bishops and cardinals and the Pope. And they're wearing ruffs, but these are not just ordinary, daily wear ruffs. These are fancy, and they're incredibly expensive and incredibly difficult to maintain, and you better believe that none of these guys was maintaining his own ruff. They had servants to do that. These are middle-class men. They are probably burghers, which was a name for people who assumed political importance, social importance in the cities of Northern Europe. It's hard to see here. There's another painting in the North Carolina Museum where it's easier to see. Those outfits they're wearing, they're black all right, but they're silk. And not only are they silk, you can tell that, the shine off of them, but you can sort of see it in the guy on the left. They are black on black silk brocade. Now, first of all, black, surprisingly enough, was the most expensive color. To make black dye was very expensive. So if you were wearing black clothing, people know back then that you had money. But I'm more fascinated by their attitude. Look at these guys. Confident, sure of themselves. Notice, too, the painting, de Keyser keeps the background black so that we can let them speak for themselves. And speak for themselves they do. These men are powerful. They're important. And they're very confident in their own skins because they know that what they do, just like the merchants and the fishermen of the harbor at Antwerp, is blessed by God. Okay? You don't have to be a priest or a bishop or a monk to have your work, to have your life blessed by God. You have to believe and act like you believe. Okay, but these people are commoners. I love this painting. This also hangs in the North Carolina Museum of Art. This is by a painter called Hans Meilich, and he's German, and it is simply called Portrait of a Man, and we don't need to know his name. This guy is confident. He's proud of who he is. He's proud of what he does. Maybe he makes barrels or shoes horses. But whatever he does, he's doing pretty well because A, he can afford to pay a high-priced painter to paint his portrait, and B, the clothes are workman's clothes, but they're nice workman's clothes. They're not rags. There are no patches here. And he's just looking out like, this is who I am. Take it or leave it, because I take it.